My name is Claire Marianne Whitaker. I am 32 years old, and I live in a cramped second-floor apartment above a laundromat in a small New England town called Middleridge. I work nights as a nurse in a hospice unit 2 towns over. Days are for sleep and trying to make sense of the quiet my life has become. Right now I am a woman who has learned to live around her memories like furniture in a dark room, careful not to bump into them, but still aware of their presence. I am tired, I am raw, and I still feel the phantom weight of a secret I never thought would be dragged into light. Before I dive in, if you're into raw, real stories that linger under your skin, please consider subscribing. Sharing this feels like stepping into sunlight with a paper cut. Painful, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. The church smelled like lilies and old books, like every small-town funeral always seems to. Sunlight streamed in through stained glass windows, pinstripes of red and blue falling across rows of faces I know too well. My brother Andrew with his chin tucked, our cousin Marcy fiddling with a rosary, Father Donnelly, who has baptized us, married us, scolded us, standing at the pulpit with a yellowed paper in his hand. My hands would not stop sweating. The fabric of my dress clung to my skin. The air conditioning in the church groaned like it was keeping a secret. We were there for Hannah, my sister. She had been gone for 6 days when they finally released the letter she left. 6 days of phone calls and murmured condolences and people asking how we were holding up. 6 days of my mother, the woman who had given everything to seem in control, pretending she was fine. I sat in the second pew because the first was reserved. I wanted to be seen but not to be the center of anything. Grief has a way of making you both small and exposed. The priest cleared his throat. His voice has always been the kind that can read a grocery list like scripture. Today, every sentence landed like a stone. He began with the usual prayers, but then he said, "Before we read the final words Hannah left, she asked that her note be read aloud at her service." The paper in his hands trembled with the same human uncertainty that made my vision tremble. He put the paper down and read, and then without preface, without the softening we all wanted, he said aloud one sentence that split the room like a knife through paper. "I always knew who deserved it." The sentence hung in the air and my throat went dry. People shifted, a child in the back began to cry, and my mother's mascara blurred into dark rivers. I could feel the room tilt. "Deserved what?" someone whispered. The priest folded his hands and continued as if he'd said nothing extraordinary at all, and as if we had not been waiting for some truth our entire lives. Some clarification we hoped would heal us. The rest of the letter unfolded in a way I had not expected. Hannah's handwriting was unmistakable. Slanted, impatient, the kind of script that always crossed her T's too high. She wrote about small things, about vowels in children's names, about the way the ocean looked in July. Then in the middle of the page she turned colder and precise like an incision. She wrote about the night on the river when the car rolled, about the way our father smelled of whiskey and diesel, about the smell of burnt sugar on his breath when he was angry. She wrote that he had not died by accident. My body registered this information as if someone had hit me in the sternum. I felt bile rise. For 20 years our family had been walking around a story that our father had died driving home alone in a storm, one of those accidents that could happen to anyone. It was what people said at dinners at church meetings, when someone asked why our mother never remarried. A tragedy, such a shame. We had never suspected otherwise because sometimes denial is easier than the alternative. Hannah's letter did not just say he wasn't an accident. It said plainly that someone had, intentionally, ended his life. She had written the name of the person who did it, and then, shockingly, the name of the person who deserved it. I felt the world narrow into a tunnel, and the air around me turn colder. My heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape through my throat. Andrew squeezed my hand hard enough to hurt. He mouthed a single word. "Who?" "Claire." The priest read it distinctly, as if to make alchemy out of letters. "Name." The pews seemed to tilt again. The stained glass swam. At that instant I understood that Hannah's last act was not a plea for mercy but a verdict. She had chosen a courtroom out of her deathbed, and I, whether I wanted to or not, was in the dock. I had been carrying a different kind of guilt for years. Guilt about leaving, about the times I'd yelled back, about the nights I'd packed my things and left in the dark because our house felt like a gaslit room where we were always on trial. But this allegation, was not something I'd ever named to anyone, not even myself. "Claire," murmured my mother, more like a prayer than a sentence. Her hands trembled and the thin skin over her fingers seemed paper-thin. "Claire," she said again, pleading histrionically as if the correct pronunciation could force a different meaning. "If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people." I was desperate to be anonymous and also desperate to be heard, and this paradox is what has made this telling so difficult. The rest of the ceremony became a blur. People said the right things. Memories of Hannah being always kind, of her volunteer work at the school, of her laugh. My sister used to laugh like a chainsaw of sunshine. I heard phrases float past me. Tragic, so unfair. We'll support you, and none of them landed on the part of me that was trying to understand why she had written my name. After the service, people clustered under the old maple trees outside the church, breathing cold November air. I could see the cemetery beyond, neat rows of stones, a field that had been measured for time. My mother spoke in clipped sentences to the minister about funeral arrangements, not looking at me. Andrew left for a nursing home run without a word. I stayed because my feet would not allow me to leave. When the crowd thinned and the church doors closed like the end of a chapter, I walked to the old family car, the one with the dent on the back where Dad always told jokes about bringing character. I held Hannah's last letter folded in my hand like contraband. My heart felt like a fist, and I realized with alarm that I could not remember the exact shape of her face from 10 years ago, the night that had begun everything. Memory isn't a tape recorder. It's a patchwork of images and feelings and the stories we tell ourselves. Now her handwriting was a new piece added to that patchwork. The name had been spoken in a space heavy with authority. Priest, church, public, and yet the truth, if it was truth, was now a hot metal plate in my palms. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. I wanted to say to the universe, to knock on its chest and ask why it would design such cruelty. But instead I folded the letter back into my pocket and walked home in the cold, the words echoing in my head like a sentence I wasn't sure my body could hold. The house on Willow Lane smelled like frying bacon and lemon oil when I was a child. Ordinary domesticities that felt like armor against the rot that lived in the corners. Our kitchen table had circles where hot mugs had rested for years, and there was a chipped photograph of our father at the far end, where he sat with his arm around Hannah as if the camera could catch what he could not say. Memory plays its dirty tricks. Sometimes I can feel the weight of his hand on my shoulder. Sometimes he is a silhouette in the hallway, a threat. Other times he's only a laugh recorded on old cassette tapes where the tape has been chewed so badly you can barely hear the words. "Claire, you're seated wrong," my mother scolded that morning at the funeral when she noticed I wasn't kneeling straight during the prayers. Her voice has always been the thin kind of control that can be mistaken for order. She is the woman who ironed boys' shirts to a crisp and taught me how to pin a crease into a collar. She is not a cruel woman in the way octopi are cruel. Her cruelty was quieter, a long, cold competence that kept us spinning. When I was 12, I watched a man in our house who smelled of sweat and whiskey transform from a father into a story we told to survive. He came home late a lot. Sometimes he apologized in the morning, with coffee and a limp bouquet of supermarket daisies. Sometimes he left again and slammed the door in a gust of winter. Once, when I was 14, he pushed Hannah into the pantry door. She did not cry. She closed the door, leaned her forehead against the cool wood, and listened to the sound of her own breath until it steadied. That is the picture I carry of her. Steady, small, containing. "You should have left sooner," my best friend Julia told me once when we were 21 and running down Main Street in the kind of reckless that felt like courage. I had packed a bag, left notes, told myself I'd go. I sat on the porch for 3 hours because leaving felt like permission for him to be right. I would be admitting that lines had been crossed and that home could not be safe. Hannah left later than I did, and she left with the certainty of someone who had not been given choices. She vowed she wouldn't be broken by him. She became the one who called the police when he was too drunk to drive, who took Andrew to soccer practice even when she was exhausted. She worked 2 jobs sometimes, knitting the frayed edges of our lives back together. There were nights, though, when I watched her from the top of the stairs as she sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug, staring at nothing. You could see in her the way the heat leaves a room. Small, almost invisible exhalations that show someone making tiny, secret decisions about how to survive. "It's fine," she would say if I asked her what was wrong, and her voice was always the kind that pledged to hold us together. The river night is a memory that refuses to settle. It's not one clean scene but a palimpsest of details that overlap. Rain on a windshield, the smell of wet leather, a cassette player blaring some song no one remembers now, a curve in the road, the sound like everything hollowing out. We were 17. We had been drinking soda in the back seat, trying to be someone brave enough to laugh at everything. The car lurched, then rolled, and for a second the world was all glass and noise. There was the smell of gasoline and copper. We crawled out with cuts and those numb, perfect shocks that leave you alive but not whole. Father died within a week. They said it was an accident. His heart had given out after the crash. We accepted that version because we were good at accepting. Who imagines, really, that anyone they love could be the kind of man who needed to be silenced? That would require other, more invasive explanations. Anger, revenge, a savagery that did not fit the stories we told ourselves about him. Later, when my mother began to slip, first small mistakes, then long pauses that changed the architecture of our kitchen, Hannah's care became something else entirely. She was the one who drove my mother to appointments, who argued with doctors, who sat in waiting rooms smelling of disinfectant and old magazines. I admired her from a distance, still harboring a childish sense that if she could be strong for everyone else, she wouldn't need to be fragile herself. But Hannah kept a private ledger. She recorded injustices without filing them away. She wrote down names, dates, nights when something had happened. I didn't know the extent of it until the letter at her funeral. For years she carried the weight of what we'd seen and what we'd pretended not to. She became, in her own way, a judge who recorded the scales but refused to let them rest. When the priest read my name, the memory of that river night changed shape. I remembered with the clarity of someone kneading dough, the exact way the back seat had smelled like orange candy and cigarettes, the way the seatbelt had cut into my collarbone, the way Hannah had whispered, "We're okay." Though I remember thinking, how could we be? I also remembered, crystalline and cold, the look on my father's face as he leaned over the center console, the way his hand had found a small vial tucked under the seat. It was something he kept for the headaches he complained about, pills in neat rows in a tiny bottle. I remember thinking at the time that he had been careless to leave it there, then tucking that observation into a pocket of my mind like a receipt I did not need. That receipt is the kind of detail that becomes sacred only after someone reads the ledger. Hannah had concluded that the vial, the way the engine had been tampered, the angle the car took off the guardrail, these were not accidents but choices. And worse, if they were choices, someone had made them. She wrote names and she wrote, "I always knew who deserved it." Who decides what anyone deserves? We like to believe that justice is a slow and rational thing. Courtrooms, law books, the neat measure of evidence. But families do not operate on paper and law. They operate on rumor, on the stories we repeat to keep ourselves sane. For Hannah, the ledger was her law. When I was younger, I believed I could outrun my past. I left Middleridge for a while. College, a cheap apartment across state lines, nights at bars where no one knew my last name. I married an impulse and divorced a regret. I kept my distance because proximity seemed to encourage old scars. The first time I came back in 5 years, Hannah hugged me like she'd been saving oxygen. She didn't ask why. She just folded me in and we both cried like two people who realized they had been holding their breath for so long they forgot how to breathe. I had secrets. The most dangerous secret, the one that sat behind all other secrets, was that I had once considered, briefly in a panic, that it would be better if Dad didn't come home. I had been 16 and scared and small. It read more like a wish than a plan. Everyone has a wish they bury somewhere ashamed, but few of us confess to the wanting. Wanting is not doing. But Hannah's words made the distance between them blur in the worst possible way. If someone had acted on a wish, who had the right to call it deserved? And if that someone was my family, what did that mean for me? Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. I found myself wanting to say a ridiculous modern impulse, that people would find it real enough to click through. But the truth of the story is not a thing to be consumed casually. It is a presence at your shoulder, a rumor that will carve paths through your days. That night I slept with the lights on, partly because the house seemed unfamiliar and partly because the letter made my skin itch in an old place, like the brush of a needle where an earlier wound had scabbed. I woke in the dark and remembered the shape of Hannah's handwriting, the curve of the S, the way she had underlined a sentence as though punctuation itself could deliver a verdict. The next day, I would begin the slow and dangerous work of confronting a family that had lain down with its secrets for years. The days after the funeral were a series of thin, repeating motions, arranging flowers, returning calls, nodding with a smile I didn't wholly feel. At the center of all of it was the letter, and at the center of the letter was me, as if Hannah had turned the mirror toward my face and decided it was time I saw myself without the filters we'd grown up using. People kept saying, "How are you?" in the way people asked the weather. They wanted an answer that would not require them to act differently. "Claire, we need to talk," my mother said one morning, leaning against the kitchen counter like she was bracing herself. The kitchen smell had become a memory of all the things people pretended to be fine with: coffee and the tang of lemon oil. My mother is the kind of woman who measures everything. She has a drawer full of receipts and an apology she recycles at funeral tables. Her hair was pulled back tight. The lines around her mouth were deep with fatigue. "It's about Hannah's letter." She didn't say the words, but the implication was clear. The letter had cracked something in our family that could not be glued back together with the usual adhesives of denial and politeness. Andrew leaned on the back of a chair and watched us both. His hands are big and he has a voice that forgives too easily. He had always been the sibling who smoothed things over, the one who believed in second chances. "Who told her to write that?" he asked finally, but it wasn't a question about coercion. It sounded more like a question searching for logic in a place where logic had no jurisdiction. Why my sister would say that about Claire? The dinner table was a landscape of small explosions. My mother accused me of lying by omission, of having told half-truths that twisted the narrative. Andrew, who had adored both of us in his own way, didn't know which side to take. Old grievances twined around new accusations, and within 5 minutes we were arguing about a decade-old argument about money and who took what at the estate sale. If this is resonating with you like it helps, I had meant to say at some point during those days, but the words seemed grotesque in the face of a family's falling apart. It felt too performative, and yet the impulse to be heard is a human reflex. I wanted answers more than I wanted revenge. I wanted to know whether Hannah had believed her own accusations or if she had been using them to punish someone she thought had gotten away with something worse. I began to dig, not because I wanted to convict myself, but because old truths are stubborn and sooner or later the light finds them. I found an envelope in Hannah's desk, carefully placed, stiff in creaselessness, like something a librarian would preserve. Inside were photographs, receipts, a map of that river road with a section circled, and pages of notes Hannah had amassed over years. Names cross-referenced, dates, small observations a private investigator might envy. It was a ledger of accumulated attention. There were meetings logged with attorneys, notes about conversations she'd had with people we'd known. And then there were pages that made my chest seizure-tight. Detailed descriptions of nights when our father had been threateningly volatile, eyewitnesses who had seen him in places he said he hadn't been, a scrapbook of small injustices catalogued like evidence. I read until my eyes blurred, until I had to close the notebook against my ribs like a prayer book. Hannah had been meticulous. She had been haunted, yes, but she had also been methodical in a way that suggested deliberate intent. If truth were a path, she had been walking it backward and leaving breadcrumbs. "Claire," my mother said one night, voice low and raw, "did you ever?" She couldn't finish. The phrase hung like a noose braided from unsaid words. I told her the truth in the only way I could. I told her about the night on the river as I remembered it, and about the vial of pills, and about how I had once, briefly, felt a dangerous thought. I told her I had not acted on it. I told her that I had left because leaving felt like a plea. Telling does not always lighten the load. Sometimes it rearranges the weight. Sometimes it makes new rooms for the secret to live in. My confession did not absolve anyone. It did, however, crack open something. Andrew refused to believe the directness of Hannah's accusations. "She loved you," he said, as if that should shield me. "She would never," but the certainty in his voice faltered. Families balance precariously on a belief in each other's essential goodness. Hannah had chosen to shake that belief like a dog shaking off water. The town began to whisper. People I hadn't seen since high school caught my eye in the grocery store with curiosity rather than sympathy. The world is small in Middleridge. Secrets move fast and empathy moves slow. Our home phone, a relic we kept because it felt like a tether to the past, rang with anonymous numbers. Letters got messy. Offers to help, offers of retribution, a few notes that were cruel and unsigned. Called Father Donnelly. He is a man who knows how to listen and make room for confession without turning it into a sermon. He asked me to come to the rectory, the place where the smell of old paper and cold coffee mingles into the smell of always being ready to receive. I thought perhaps I could ask him to stop reading the letter in church, to ask for privacy. Instead, he listened and offered more than solace. He suggested I meet with a lawyer. "If there are things that need to be sorted, Claire," he said gently, "we must take care of them properly. Lawyers are strange human fridges that make the private into the public." I met with a woman named Elena who had kind hands but a hard way of looking at facts. She told me in legal terms what I already suspected, that Hannah's letter was a claim, and claims often lead to investigations. In the background of the law, there was the possibility that decisions would be made that would not satisfy anybody's sense of righteousness. I began to piece things together in a way that felt dangerous. Hannah's notes mentioned a man named Michael Barnes, a mechanic who had worked on Dad's car in the weeks before the river night. The notes had a terse line. "He knows the angle." There was also a log of phone calls, one at 11:58 p.m. the night Dad had left, and a card from a motel in a neighboring town. It felt as though Hannah had been assembling a case in secret. And for what? For justice. For truth. For a way to sleep without dreams that kicked like trapped animals. One night, in a moment of reckless clarity, I knocked on the door of the tiny cabin at the edge of town where Michael Barnes lived. He was older than I expected, with hands that showed the markings of someone who knew metal intimately. There was apology in his eyes, like something he had not known how to give himself. "I didn't mean for any of it," he said, voice thick. He confessed small things. Sloppy repairs, a missed bolt, how he'd been paid in cash and hushes back then. He said he'd seen Dad that night and had argued with him about a deal gone wrong. He said he had been texting with someone that night, someone who had offered him money to make something look like an accident. His hands shook as he said it. The word accident suddenly felt like decorative language designed to soften a monstrosity. Michael's confession pulled up roots I thought were steady. If there had been motive and opportunity, at some point someone had decided a life was a ledger item. Hannah had been trying to map that ledger, and in mapping it she had decided who deserved what. I did not know then what to do with that knowledge. On one hand there was relief, neat answers, a map from chaos to narrative. On the other there was a creeping realization. Hannah had known more than we had suspected. She had known enough to call something a deliberate ending, and her final words had named me as the person who deserved it. Why would she do that? Was she naming me as the guilty party, or as the one who deserved what? What in Hannah's mind equated deserving with punishment? The more I learned, the more the lines blurred. Hannah's naming of me felt less like an accusation and more like a transfer. She had taken her ledger, and with the final ink of her life, she had placed the burden of truth on me. Perhaps she thought I would be the one brave enough to follow through, to go to the authorities with the details she had amassed. Perhaps she believed that I deserved to be stripped bare because I had run away from the family's responsibilities. Or maybe, in a crueler interpretation, she believed I had been the actor. The ambiguity devoured sleep. Has something like this ever happened to you? I asked myself at night, whispering into the dark like a confession. I was beginning to understand that families are not just collections of love and hurt. They are systems of stories, and someone must keep the ledger. Hannah had kept hers with a ferocity that would not be soothed by weeping or prayers. She had chosen to tell, and in telling she had changed the stakes for all of us. The investigation began quietly, like weather changing, almost unnoticeable at first, then undeniable. The sheriff's office called. The detective, a stoic woman named Ruiz, wanted to talk. She had a way of looking at you as if she could see the past folded under your skin. "We don't have to treat this like a homicide case," she told me in the bland legal voice of someone trying to keep options open. "But we need to follow up on the leads." Following leads feels dangerously like opening drawers you cannot close. I handed over Hannah's notebook because I could no longer carry it like contraband in my pocket. Elena told me to get a forensic analyst to look at the car records, to subpoena phone logs, to find any kind of pattern that could make an accident into a narrative of intent. It felt clinical and necessary. Town meetings, people stared. The pastor kept his hands folded and his face grave. The more evidence the detective gathered, the louder the whispers grew. My mother started sleeping in short bursts, the edges of her sentences dissolving into complaints about the cold. Andrew tried to be my anchor, but sometimes his face looked like someone floating in a body that didn't belong to him anymore. Detective Ruiz found a string of texts between Michael Barnes and an unknown number. Texts offering cash and an insistence that the job be clean. The analysis of the car revealed an improperly installed seatbelt anchor, tampered with in a way that suggested more than incompetence. If one thing was clear, someone had engineered the crash. Ooh. The conversation that shocked me the most was with Father Donnelly, who sat with his hands clasped, the way a man prays when he is not sure which God to call. "Sometimes," he said slowly, looking at me like he was trying to be kind and honest at once, "the people carrying the ledger are not always saints. Sometimes they protect themselves. Sometimes they use the ledger to make someone else carry the shame." "Are you saying Hannah did it?" I asked because I needed him to say the words, to make sense of the jumbled map I was trying to follow. "I'm saying she kept a ledger," he replied, "and ledgers can be dangerous. But I cannot say what happened that night. I can only say that if you want the truth, you must be both brave and gentle with it. The truth will have teeth. There are moments in life when every instinct tells you to flee. I felt that way the day I was served with a civil suit. Someone, anonymous at first, accused me of causing my father's death. The legal jargon felt like shards of glass. Every sentence in the complaint was coated in accusation. The town had come to believe that names mean something. Hannah had given them a name. The world, anxious for tidy explanations, had filled in the rest. I hired Elena to defend me. She moved like a chess player, making calm choices in a field that felt like war. The suit was baseless in many ways. An attempt to shame me publicly, but the damage it did was real. People looked at me in supermarkets with pity and suspicion folded together. I lost clients at the hospice who took my being related to Hannah as a reason to transfer. Strangers wrote letters that arrived at my workplace. My life narrowed. Hannah's notebook turned into an artifact in the legal sense, and a relic in the familial sense. We discovered that she had met with a private investigator a year before she died. Someone who had promised to find out who tampered with the car. The investigator's notes were uncertain and halting. He had suspected Michael, and suggested getting more proof. Hannah had also written in a careful hand, "If anything happens to me, follow the chain." Then in the margin, in the same impatient slant, she'd scribbled, "Do not trust anyone with my checks." I began to understand her final words in a different key. "I always knew who deserved it," might mean she always knew who deserved what she had decided to give. Knowledge, truth, or perhaps a kind of punishment. She might have been naming me because she believed I would take up the mission to see the ledger through. She might have been naming me because, in her private justice, She thought I needed to be shamed for running away. Or, darker still, she might have been naming me because she believed I had actively done something. The gradient between those possibilities felt like a canyon I could fall into at any moment. The trial of whispers turned into subpoenas and depositions. People were called to testify. Michael Barnes denied intent in an almost robotically sincere way, but his bank records showed cash deposits the night of the crash. He maintained he'd been paid for a repair. Detective Ruiz found inconsistencies in his story. Each small finding was a pebble knocking loose the edifice we'd built. One afternoon, my brother Andrew and I sat at the old diner across from the courthouse. The coffee was lukewarm and the jukebox played a song that used to be our mother's favorite. Andrew's hands shook as the waitress poured more sugar into his cup. "You should have told us earlier," he said, and it was not accusation so much as a kind of raw bewilderment. "Why didn't you tell us you suspected?" He stopped. The implication hung like a raw nerve. He was trying to understand the logic of a girl who leaves and then wants to be protected as if absence translates to innocence. What would that have done? Yes. Would it have changed anything? We were children. We were frightened. The world was loud and full of someone else's excuses. Hannah promised she would carry it. She kept her ledger. Maybe she thought naming me would make me stop running. Andrew looked at me as if he had never seen me entire. "You don't get to be the only one who ran, Claire," he said softly. "We all chose how to survive. But now we need to choose how to live." There were calls then from people I had not thought to expect. Friends of Hannah, a neighbor who had always seemed indifferent. Some offered support. Some offered a sharp kind of judgment. The town is a living thing. Its appetite for scandal is endless. "Has something like this ever happened to you?" I asked again, louder this time, not at a comment box but at myself. I thought about the ledger and how we hold it, about Hannah's last intentional act. I realized that nothing in my childhood had prepared me for the publicness of grief or the way shame can be weaponized. The detective found fingerprints on the seatbelt anchor. Old ones, smudged but human. One matched my father's long afterlife. Another was unknown. The unknown print belonged to a woman. The thought of that particular discovery sent me home reeling, because if fingerprints can be proof, they can also be misread. Evidence is not the same as meaning. Evidence is a set of facts waiting for a story to be attached to them. I began to see that whatever the legal outcome, something irreversible had happened in the fabric of my family. Hannah's final act, delivered in ink and solemnity, had reshaped how we thought of each other. She had forced us to examine our assumptions and, in doing so, invited us to forgive or to condemn. I could feel a kind of small, stubborn hope bud. Maybe truth would not be a weapon but a vehicle. Maybe once the ledger opened, we could begin to close the accounts with something like honesty. What no one had expected was that the last week of the investigation would bring a confession not from the big players, the mechanic, the anonymous paymaster, but from our mother. It happened on a morning when the air had that brittle edge that makes the underthings of a house feel cold. I had stopped by my mother's house to collect a sweater I had left. Her kitchen was a map of stillness. A sink full of clean dishes, a radio playing an old hymn, a calendar with days crossed out for appointments. Her hands trembled as she handed me the sweater, and then, unexpectedly, she sat down and put a hand to her forehead like someone keeping a fever at bay. "I couldn't tell you then," she said, voice thin. "I didn't know how to tell you the way you girls needed to hear it." The kitchen chair creaked under the weight of a history. It felt suddenly ordinary to be in this small room with the woman who had been the axis of my childhood's gravity. My father, your grandfather, had been involved with people he shouldn't have been. He got into trouble with a group that was not local, men who made threats. Your father was not a saint. He was a man who owed more than money. Once he started being threatened, he got scared. He met with Michael, he asked for help. I didn't know everything then. She looked at me as if searching for some passport back into compassion. "What are you saying?" I asked, though a part of me already expected a new mapping of culpability to appear. She exhaled, and the confession came in short phrases, like a woman tripping over hard stones. There were threats. There were offers to make someone go away. And men who made promises for silence. I thought if I could give them something they'd go. I gave them money once. I went to the motel. I begged for silence. It was not. She collapsed into a series of broken apologies. I didn't want him harmed. But I was desperate. I was trying to protect my family. And I did things you should never have to do. My stomach turned. The world in my head ricocheted between neat facts and messy morality. My mother's confession meant the ledger was more complicated than I had thought. She admitted to meeting with men who had the capacity for violence, but insisted she never asked for murder. In her telling, it was extortion followed by remorse. That same week, Michael Barnes turned state's witness. He admitted to tampering with a seatbelt, an act he claimed he had consented to under duress from men offering money. He testified that he had later been paid to make the crash look unintentional. The courtroom smelled like bleach and dust. The judge's voice was flat. The mystery of who deserved it had been translated into a set of legal facts. Collusion, tampering, coercion. But even with those legal facts laid bare, the moral landscape remained jagged. Hannah's letter had named me as the person who deserved it. What did she mean? In a private conversation I finally managed with an old friend of Hannah's who had been with her the weekend before she died, I learned what Hannah had been trying to do. She'd been working to put together not only evidence but a script for how truth would be told, one line at a time. She had believed that naming me would be the first step in making me face the ledger we had all been avoiding. She had wanted me to stay, to fight, to not run. She thought you were turning away, her friend said quietly. Not because she didn't love you. Because she thought someone had to stay and suffering is easier to face with two people. That put a different light on the accusation. I always knew who deserved it, reframed. Rather than declaring me guilty of wrongdoing, Hannah's words could be read as giving me custody of the burden. She believed I deserved, in the sense of being entrusted with a mission, to be the one who carried the truth forward. This reframing did not undo the sting of public suspicion or the private scars. But emotionally, it shifted the axis of my culpability into responsibility. Instead of being condemned as a perpetrator, perhaps Hannah had chosen me because she believed I had the moral courage she feared she did not possess. It is a complicated, almost cruel, kind of kindness, to trust someone with the truth in their final moments. In a small hearing, Michael and several of the men who had been involved were charged. Evidence showed orchestration. My mother was not charged. She made deals, confessed to the meetings, and took the penalty the prosecutor thought would suffice. She said she had been trying to protect us. If that was her defense, it was a poor one. The court sentenced people in clean, numerical terms. Years, fines, probation. The law rendered verdicts. It did not soothe the fractures between the living. After the legal dust settled, something else had to happen. Something outside courtrooms. I had to decide whether to let Hannah's last act make me into a martyr or a prisoner. I had to decide what to do with the inheritance of her ledger. I could let it define me or I could choose a different kind of owning. Acceptance. I sat at the river once, in the place where the accident had happened years ago. The current was slow, exacting. I had on a wool coat that smelled like detergent and my throat felt full of small stones. Andrew came and sat beside me without speaking. The two of us watched the water, and in the silence, there was a kind of forgiveness that did not require words. This was never about revenge, Andrew said finally. Not in Hannah's head. She wanted truth, Claire. Maybe she thought her last act would make us stop making excuses. I told him about the night in the river again, not to prove anything but to let the memory unclench. He listened, his presence steady. There was no whitewashing. There was only the acceptance that our family had been damaged by forces inside and out. We were not victims only. We were also culprits in the stories we told ourselves. Has something like this ever happened to you? People still asked in the quiet places of my life. Co-workers, new friends, listeners of the channel that has somehow found this story. The answer is, not exactly. But in a way, everything we go through that leaves us fragile is a permutation of this template. Someone names us. We either accept the name or refuse it. The world writes the rest. I chose to forgive, but it is not an act of forgetting. Forgiveness is a daily rehearsal of the muscles you once kept tight. I wrote to Hannah many times illogically, as if ink could bridge the distance. I accepted that she had chosen to be the one to hold the ledger, and that her last words had been intended as a torch, however clumsily passed. The lesson I learned, bruised and stubborn as it is this: truth is not a weapon to be wielded for punishment. It is a tool, heavy and awkward, that can be used to rebuild or to raise. Whether it heals depends mostly on what the living choose to make of it. In naming me, Hannah forced all of us to reconsider our stories. It hurt, it broke open, but it also demanded that we either become smaller people or larger ones. But honesty is not a bomb that works instantly. It takes time and other people's willingness to be rewritten in your memory. The town had begun to divide itself into people who believed the ledger and people who believed the storyteller. In the middle of it, I learned the most difficult lesson. Sometimes being named does not make you guilty, and sometimes not being named does not make you innocent. We are all uneven instruments, capable of both damage and repair.